What did a funeral director hide for 40 years? And what was never meant to be found? Welcome to Darkness Stories. 5 true horror tales from those who work with the dead. Hit like, subscribe, and let's step into the darkness. I found the box on a Tuesday. Tuesday matters because that's the day we do deep cleaning at Willowbrook Funeral Home. The kind of scrubbing that gets into corners untouched for decades. Mr. Harrison had just retired after 40 years of service, 40 years of preparing the departed, of offering comfort to grieving families, of working the overnight shifts nobody else wanted. The old man had earned his rest, everyone said. A model employee. His prep room locker was the last thing to clear out. I pulled the bottom drawer, heard something slide. And that's when I saw it wedged behind the wooden panel lining a metal lockbox. Small enough to hide, heavy enough to mean something. The lock was old. I shouldn't have opened it. I think part of me knew that even as I fetched the bolt cutters from maintenance. Inside were Polaroids. Hundreds of them organized in clear sleeves. Dated and labeled with meticulous care. At first glance, I thought they were professional documentation. We photograph our work sometimes, for records, for insurance. But these weren't those kinds of photos. These were intimate. The first image showed a young woman, maybe 25, photographed from directly above. The flash had created harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheekbone, the peaceful set of her mouth. Too close. The angle was all wrong, not the distant, respectful documentation of our work. But something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl before my brain could articulate why. I flipped to the next photo. A young man this time, early 30s perhaps. Same overhead angle. Same harsh flash creating pools of shadow in the hollows of his face. The camera had been positioned inches away, close enough that I could see the individual pores of his skin, the fine hairs of his eyebrows. My hands started shaking somewhere around photo 15. Each image had a caption written in faded blue ink on the white border. Neat handwriting. The kind they taught in schools 50 years ago. Beautiful when still. 23 minutes new record. Nobody interrupted this time. Perfume still lingering. I should have stopped. I should have called someone. Instead, I kept flipping through the sleeves, my breath coming shorter with each page. The photographs didn't just document bodies, they documented time itself. I could see it in the film stock, in the way the images aged. Some carried the soft, amber warmth of old Polaroids from the 70s, their edges already fading as if memory itself were retreating. Others were colder, sharper, unmistakably from later decades. The most recent photograph was dated 2018, only months before Mr. Harrison announced his retirement. There were 347 of them. I counted twice, because I couldn't accept the number the first time. What made the collection unbearable wasn't its size, but its intimacy. A smudged fingerprint lingered in the corner of one image, as though the person holding the camera had hesitated, or trembled before pressing the shutter. Faces reappeared across multiple photographs, captured again and again from slightly different angles, the way someone lingers when they don't want a moment to end. Each photo carried a date and a time, written with careful precision, always after midnight. Always during the hours when the funeral home was silent, when no one was meant to be there except the overnight attendant. I pulled up our records with shaking fingers. Cross-referenced the dates. Every single one matched a night Mr. Harrison had volunteered for the overnight shift. The pattern emerged like a sickness in my gut. He'd always been so helpful, so willing to take the difficult cases, the ones that came in late, the ones nobody else wanted to handle. Young people mostly. Unexpected passings. Beautiful people stolen by sudden tragedy who hadn't had time to age. too changed to become anything other than what they were in that final moment. I thought about our prep room protocols, how we'd always trusted Harrison to work alone. He was the veteran, the one who trained everyone else. How he'd insisted he work better without distraction. How he'd locked the prep room door for respect and privacy. How no one had questioned it because he'd been doing this since before most of us were born. 8,000 bodies had passed through Willowbrook in 40 years. 347 photographs sat in the box before me. What made these people special? What had he seen in them that made them worthy of his collection? I couldn't stop staring at photo 199, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, with dark hair spread across the prep table like a halo. The caption read, "Waited all week for this one." The timestamp showed 4:32. I imagined him in that room, alone in the middle of the night, camera in hand, taking his time with someone's daughter while her family slept, trusting us with their grief. The police came that afternoon. I'd called the moment my hands stopped shaking enough to dial. They found Mr. Harrison in his retirement cottage, tending his garden. According to the detective who interviewed him, he seemed almost relieved when they arrived. Tired of carrying the secret, maybe. Or perhaps he'd always known that eventually, someone would look behind that drawer panel. His statement, delivered in the same calm voice he'd used to comfort grieving families for decades, made the newspapers. I never harmed anyone. They had already gone. I simply preserved the moment when they were most perfect. Before time could corrupt them. Before decay could steal their beauty. Their families got a few hours with them. I had entire nights. The detective told me Harrison showed no remorse. No understanding that what he'd done was wrong. In his mind, he'd been an artist, a curator, preserving something beautiful that would otherwise be lost. The funeral industry changed its regulations after that. Mandatory two-person teams for all prep work. Security cameras in every room. Recording everything 24/7 SDH. No one works alone with the departed anymore. But I still think about the questions we can't answer. Of those 347 photographs, how many families known? How many would want to know that the last person to spend time with their loved one had been taking souvenirs, creating private moments in the darkness? And what about the other 7,653? The ones who didn't make it into the collection? Were they less special? Or had Harrison simply run out of film? The worst part, the thing that keeps me awake, is this. Harrison retired with full honors. There was a party, cake, flowers, speeches about dedication and service. People thanked him for his compassion during their darkest hours. He smiled and shook hands and accepted their gratitude. If someone hadn't been thorough during that Tuesday cleaning, if that box had remained hidden behind that panel for another few years until the building renovation we've been planning, would anyone ever have known? I transferred to a different funeral home after 2 months. Couldn't stand being in that prep room anymore. Couldn't stop imagining all those nights, all those hours alone in the dark with people who couldn't refuse, couldn't object, couldn't say no. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about the other funeral homes, the other overnight attendants, the other 40-year veterans with impeccable records and helpful attitudes. How many of them have boxes? How many collections are still hidden, waiting for someone to pull the wrong drawer, to look behind the wrong panel, to discover what happens in the silence of the overnight hours when the rest of the world is sleeping and the departed are at their most vulnerable? Mr. Harrison kept his collection for 40 years. He's not the first person to work alone in the darkness. And I don't think he'll be the last. 12 years as a mortuary cosmetologist, and you develop instincts. Not supernatural ones, just the kind that come from understanding how trauma marks the body, how injuries present, how death leaves its signature on skin and bone. So when I started working on Sarah Mitchell, something in my gut went cold. 28 years old. The intake form said motor vehicle accident, single car, lost control on a wet road, struck a tree, no other vehicles involved, pronounced dead at the scene. Husband was devastated. The intake notes mentioned, wanted a quick service, cremation to follow. Standard tragedy, the kind we see too often. But the body told a different story. I started with the face, as I always do. Foundation, concealer, the careful work of making someone look like they're sleeping rather than gone. The frontal impact had caused facial trauma, swelling, contusions, the kind of damage you'd expect from a steering wheel. Except the angle was wrong. I've worked hundreds of car accident cases. The pattern of facial injuries follows the physics: forehead contusions from windshield impact, steering wheel marks across the cheek and jaw, airbag burns. Sarah had some of these, yes, but the primary trauma was to the back of her head. A depressed fracture at the occipital bone, already noted in the medical examiner's report, attributed to the headrest on impact. But headrests don't fracture skulls. They're designed to prevent injury, not cause it. I continued working, my hands moving automatically while my mind catalogued inconsistencies. Concealer on the wrists revealed something that made me pause. Bruising, circular, uniform. On both wrists. Dark enough to have occurred at least a day or two before death. The kind of marks that come from being gripped hard for a sustained period. Defensive wounds, my training whispered. But the report said single vehicle accident. I moved to the torso, checking for additional trauma that might need cosmetic work. The autopsy incisions were neat, professional. But underneath, through the translucent quality of death pale skin, I could see more bruising. Ribs on the left side already healing. The yellowing green color that meant 2, maybe 3 weeks old. Sarah Mitchell had broken ribs weeks before she died. That wasn't in the accident report. I shouldn't have continued. Professional boundaries exist for a reason. My job was cosmetic restoration, not investigation. But my hands kept working, kept discovering. Bruising on the inner thighs. Faint but unmistakable. Scratch marks on her back, some old enough to have scarred. And then I found the makeup. Not my makeup, hers. Still visible in the creases of her neck despite the trauma. Despite the autopsy. Despite everything. Professional concealer, expensive. The kind you use when you're trying to hide something important. Applied carefully over her throat, over her wrists, layered to cover what she didn't want anyone to see. Sarah Mitchell had been hiding her injuries before she died. I was still standing there, foundation brush suspended over her face, when the husband appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard him come in. The viewing room door was supposed to be locked during preparation. How much longer? Derek Mitchell. Early 30s. Athletic build, dressed in an expensive suit. His eyes were dry. His voice was steady. The family wants to move the service up. Tomorrow if possible. We'd like to proceed with cremation quickly. Help everyone. Move forward. Too calm. Too controlled. Too eager to turn his wife into ash. I need more time, I said, not looking at him. The cosmetic work is complex. She doesn't need to be perfect. Just presentable for a quick viewing. I take pride in my work, Mr. Mitchell. Of course. A pause. You're very thorough. I appreciate that. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. Not a compliment, a warning. I'm watching you. After he left, I stood over Sarah's body for a long time. Around me. The funeral home was quiet. It was after hours. Most staff had gone home. Just me, the deceased, and a choice that felt suddenly, terrifyingly significant. I could finish my work. Apply the foundation. Blend the concealer. Make Sarah Mitchell look peaceful for her abbreviated viewing. Sign off on the preparation. Let the cremation proceed. Collect my fee. Go home. No one would question it. The medical examiner had already ruled it an accident. A police report was filed. The insurance claim was processing. Everything official had already decided what happened to Sarah Mitchell. Except her body was screaming a different story. I thought about those circular bruises. The defensive positioning. The old injuries carefully hidden beneath makeup she'd applied herself. A woman who'd learned to conceal trauma. Who'd practiced the art of looking fine when she wasn't. And I thought about Derek Mitchell's dry eyes, his eagerness for cremation. The way he'd appeared in the preparation room uninvited, checking on my progress. Making sure I wasn't looking too closely. I set down my brush. Pulled out my phone. Stared at it for a full minute before making the call. Mr. Henderson, it's Melissa. I need you to come back to the funeral home. Now. We have a problem. James Henderson. The funeral director arrived 20 minutes later. I showed him everything: the wrist bruises, the heel drib fractures, the pattern of injuries that didn't match the accident narrative. I showed him the makeup Sarah had applied herself, still visible despite everything. This could be nothing, he said carefully. People have old injuries. Car accidents cause complex trauma patterns. Look at the head wound. Really look at it. He did. I watched his expression change as he saw what I'd seen. That the primary impact came from behind, not from the collision itself. If we delay this cremation. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Lawsuits. Accusations. The Mitchell family was prominent. Well-connected. We'd be questioning an official ruling, impeding a grief-stricken husband's wishes. I can't sign the cosmetic preparation release. I said quietly. Not in good conscience. Not when her body is telling me she didn't die the way the paperwork says she did. Henderson was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll make the calls. The investigation that followed wasn't quick or easy. The medical examiner initially stood by the accident ruling. But when pressed to reconcile the old injuries, the defensive bruising, the impact pattern, cracks began to show in the official story. Neighbors came forward. They'd heard arguments, seen Sarah with unexplained injuries she'd explained away with clumsy accidents. Her best friend admitted Sarah had confided about the abuse. That she'd been planning to leave. That she'd been documenting everything for a divorce filing. The night of the accident, 3 people heard shouting from the Mitchell house. Heard it or slam. Heard Derek's truck start up 15 minutes before Sarah's car allegedly left the driveway. Forensics re-examined the vehicle. Found evidence of a second impact. One consistent with being rear-ended. Found Sarah's blood on the steering wheel, but also on the driver's side window, the pattern wrong for a frontal collision. The case went to trial 9 months later. I testified about what I'd found: the hidden injuries, the pattern of trauma, the makeup she'd used to conceal her suffering. The defense attorney tried to discredit me, suggested I was overstepping my expertise, imagining conspiracies. But the jury saw the photographs, heard the testimony, understood that Sarah Mitchell had been trying to tell people for years, in the only way she could be, by surviving long enough to leave evidence. Derek Mitchell was convicted of second-degree murder. The prosecution established he'd struck her during an argument, causing the head trauma that killed her, then staged the car accident to cover it up. He'd almost succeeded. If the cremation had proceeded as scheduled, the evidence would have vanished forever. I didn't receive any thanks from the Mitchell family. Derek's parents threatened to sue me for defamation, for delaying the funeral, for causing additional pain to their grieving family. Some people in town stopped using our funeral home, uncomfortable with what they saw as my overreach. But Sarah's mother found me after the verdict, took my hands in hers with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for listening to her," she whispered. "Thank you for being the one who finally heard. I still work at Henderson's son's funeral home. I still do cosmetic preparation, still help families say goodbye to their loved ones with dignity and care. But I look more carefully now. I pay attention to the stories bodies tell, the ones that contradict paperwork, that whisper about violence hidden behind closed doors, that speak in the language of bruises and fractures and carefully applied makeup. Most of the time, a car accident is just a car accident. A fall is just a fall. Death comes naturally, or accidentally, or through genuine tragedy. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes the body on my table is a crime scene, a last testament, a final plea for someone to notice, to question, to care enough to look beneath the surface. The dead can't speak. That's what everyone says. But they're wrong. The dead speak volumes if you know how to listen. In the pattern of their injuries, in the age of their bruises, in the makeup they applied to hide the truth from a world that didn't want to see. Sarah Mitchell spoke to me from beyond death. She showed me her wrists, her ribs, her carefully concealed suffering. She waited 12 years for someone like me, someone who'd spent enough time with the deceased to recognize when something was wrong. I heard her. I listened. And I didn't look away. That's all she needed. Someone to bear witness. Someone to refuse to let her truth be cremated along with her body. Sometimes I think about how close it came. If Derek had chosen a different funeral home, one that didn't employ someone with my specific experience. If the service had been scheduled a day earlier, before I'd started the cosmetic work. If I decided that staying silent was safer, easier, more professional, Sarah would have become ash. The investigation would never have happened. Derek would have mourned publicly, perhaps remarried eventually, and no one would have known. That thought keeps me vigilant, keeps me looking, keeps me listening to the stories that the dead tell in bruises under foundation, in fractures beneath skin, in all the hidden evidence of lives lived in fear and pain. Because sometimes, the only voice the dead have left is someone willing to read the language of their wounds. And sometimes that's enough to bring the truth into the light, even if it comes too late to save them. At least it's not too late for justice. 22 years in this profession, and you learn to trust the signs. The body doesn't lie. Temperature, vividity, rigor mortis, these are facts, not feelings. I'd seen over 3,000 cases, guided families through their worst days, then prepared their loved ones with professional detachment that came from experience, not callousness. That's what I told myself as I performed the final check on Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, 73 years old. Passed away 36 hours earlier from cardiac arrest in her sleep. Peaceful, the family said. Natural, the doctors confirmed. Everything had been textbook. Embalming went smoothly. Cosmetic work was minimal. She looked exactly as her daughters wanted her to look. At rest, finally free from pain. The viewing was scheduled for 10 a.m. I always did one last check before sealing the casket. A personal ritual I'd maintained throughout my career. Just me, the departed, and the quiet of the early morning hours, when Sterling's son's funeral home stood empty except for the hum of the ventilation system. 3:47 a.m. according to the clock on the prep room wall. I adjusted her hands one final time, made sure the rosary was properly positioned. Checked that her hair hadn't shifted. Professional pride. Everything perfect for the family. Then her eyes opened. Not gradually. Not the slow flutter of eyelids you might attribute to settling tissue or residual muscle tension. They opened fully, both at once, and looked directly at me. I've gone over that moment 10,000 times since. Tried to rationalize it, explain it, categorize it as something my exhausted mind had manufactured. But I know what I saw. Those weren't the eyes of a corpse. I'd seen dead eyes before. Milky, unfocused, the light gone from them like windows in an abandoned house. These were different. Clear, conscious, aware, and terrified. My training kicked in before my brain could catch up. I checked her carotid pulse, nothing. Held my hand over her mouth and nose. No breath. Her skin was cold. 12 degrees Celsius when I checked her temperature an hour earlier. The livor mortis was complete. Dark purple pooling along her back and shoulders where gravity had pulled the blood after her heart stopped. Rigor mortis had peaked and passed, her limbs moving with that peculiar stiffness of a body that had been dead for more than a day. Every single indicator said the same thing. Eleanor Hartley had been deceased for 36 hours. But her eyes stayed open, fixed on mine. Not randomly, not vaguely. They tracked my movement when I stepped to the left, followed me when I moved to check the monitors I'd already disconnected. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. An eternity compressed into heartbeats I could feel in my throat. Then they closed again, as smoothly as they'd opened. I stood there, my hand pressed against the metal table for balance, trying to force air into lungs that had forgotten how to expand. The rational part of my brain, the part that had carried me through 2 decades of death-cataloged explanations, post-mortem muscle spasm, delayed neural discharge. The stapedius muscle in the middle ear could trigger eyelid movement hours after death. It was rare, but documented, scientific, explainable. But that didn't account for the direction of her gaze, or the single tear that had slid from the corner of her right eye, cutting a track through the powder I'd applied to her cheek. I called my colleague, David, who lived 10 minutes away. Woke him up stammering about reflexes and muscle contractions, trying to sound professional instead of unhinged. He came, bless him, because that's what partners do. We examined Mrs. Hartley together under the fluorescent lights that made everything look clinical and manageable. Nothing. She was exactly as she should be. Still, cold, gone. Post-mortem mycolinus, David said, his hand on my shoulder. I've seen it a few times. The brain's stem can fire random signals even after death. It's unsettling, but it's just biology. For 4 seconds, I asked. Could have been less. Time distorts when you're startled. You are probably tired, working alone at 4 in the morning. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The viewing went smoothly. Mrs. Hartley looked peaceful in her casket, surrounded by lilies and photographs of a life well lived. Her 3 daughters stood beside her, holding hands, crying the necessary tears. Everything proceeded exactly as it should. Then, a week later, the youngest daughter, Catherine, returned to collect her mother's personal effects. The jewelry we'd removed before preparation, the clothes she'd been wearing, the small items families often forget in their grief. We were in my office, and I was signing the release forms when Catherine said, "Can I ask you something?" It's going to sound strange. Of course. Did anything unusual happen? During the preparation? The pen stilled in my hand. What do you mean? Catherine's fingers twisted together in her lap. My mother had tapophobia, the fear of being buried alive. She'd had it since she was young. She'd read some Victorian horror story about premature burial, and it never left her. For 40 years, she made us promise that when she died we'd wait 72 hours minimum before burial, just to be absolutely certain. The room felt smaller suddenly, colder. But the doctors said it was impossible, Catherine continued. She had a massive coronary. She was on the monitors when it happened. They documented everything. There was no doubt. And the funeral home has regulations. You can't just keep a body indefinitely. So we followed the standard protocol. 36 hours. She looked up at me then, and I saw her mother's eyes in her face. Did she open her eyes, at any point? Even for a second? The question sat between us like a living thing. I thought about professional protocols, about liability, about the comfort of grieving families, about the difference between what we know and what we can prove. I thought about those 5 seconds at 3:47. Post-mortem reflexes can occur, I said carefully. Muscle contractions, neural firings. They're involuntary responses, not consciousness. Your mother had passed, Catherine. All the medical indicators confirmed it. That's not what I asked. No, I admitted. It's not. She nodded slowly, understanding what I couldn't say. Thank you for being honest. After she left, I sat alone in my office and stared at the certifications on my wall. 22 years of expertise. Thousands of cases. Scientific certainty built on measurable facts. But I changed my protocols that day. Now I wait an extra 12 hours when I can, bending regulations as far as they'll allow. I never work alone during late-night preparations anymore. And I always perform multiple checks before sealing a casket, not just a professional standard, but my own private ritual of certainty. Because here's what keeps me awake some nights: medicine isn't perfect. Death isn't always instant. The brain can linger, starved of oxygen, dancing on the edge of shutdown. Modern equipment can miss things. Rare conditions can mimic death so closely that even experienced professionals are fooled. And sometimes in that space between dying and dead, consciousness might persist. Aware, unable to move or speak or do anything except open your eyes one last time and hope someone sees. The textbooks call it Lazarus syndrome, spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation attempts. Rare, but documented. Usually within minutes, occasionally within hours. But what if the return isn't complete? What if it's just a flicker, a final firing of neurons, a last desperate attempt to signal that something's wrong? I don't know if Mrs. Hartley's eyes opened from random muscle contractions or from something else, some fragment of awareness, some last moment of consciousness fighting against the inevitable. I'll never know. That's what makes it worse than any horror I could have imagined. Not the supernatural, not the impossible, but the terrible uncertainty of biology itself. The knowledge that the line between life and death isn't always as clear as we want it to be. And sometimes in the dead hours before dawn, that line might blur just enough for someone to look back at us from the other side. Just for a moment. Just long enough to wonder, did they know? I still work at Sterling Sons. I'm good at my job. Families trust me with their most difficult moments, and I honor that trust with every preparation. Every service, every final goodbye. But I will never work alone at 3:47. I am again. And I will never stop checking. One more time. Just to be sure. Because the most terrifying thing in this world isn't that the dead might wake. It's that they might have been trying to tell us something all along. And we weren't listening. The preparation room at 2:30 a.m. is a particular kind of quiet. Not peaceful silence, never feels peaceful when you're alone with the dead. But absolute. The kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of the refrigeration units, the click of the thermostat, your own heartbeat if you focus on it. I've worked night shifts at Riverside Memorial for 15 years. I know every sound this building makes, every groan of settling foundation, every whisper of the ventilation system. I know what belongs and what doesn't. So when I heard the breath, I knew immediately it was wrong. Mr. Robert Chen, 56 years old. Massive stroke, pronounced dead at County General 8 hours earlier. Standard preparation: arterial embalming, cavity treatment, cosmetic work for the viewing scheduled into days. Nothing complicated, nothing unusual. I was doing the final check, making sure the sutures were invisible. The cosmetics natural, when I heard it. A long, slow exhalation. Right beside my ear, close enough that I felt the warmth of it against my cheek. I spun around. The room was empty. Of course it was empty. I was alone, door locked. Just me and Mr. Chen on the preparation table. But I'd felt it. Heard it. A breath with weight to it. With intent. Residual air in the lungs, I said aloud, because sometimes hearing your own voice helps. Perfectly normal. Bodies release gas. They settle. They make sounds. Except bodies don't breathe with that kind of rhythm. That kind of deliberation. I forced myself to continue working. Adjusted his collar. Checked his hands were properly positioned. Professional tasks. Muscle memory taking over when my brain wanted to flee. The second breath came when I paused to study his face. This time I was certain. Not a random release of gas from decomposition. Not the building settling. A breath. In undoubt. Measured. Like someone trying to speak but unable to form words. I looked at Mr. Chen's face more carefully. In 15 years, you develop a sense for how the dead should look. There's a relaxation that comes with death. A letting go of tension that transforms even the most troubled face into something approaching peace. Mr. Chen's face wasn't peaceful. The muscles around his jaw were tight. His brow slightly furrowed. The set of his mouth suggested words caught mid-formation, frozen at the moment of death. He looked like someone who'd been interrupted. You're imagining things, I told myself. It's 2:30. In the morning. You're tired, and you've been doing this too long if you're seeing stress in a corpse. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The weight in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, expectant, like the moment before someone speaks, when you know they're gathering words. I tried to focus on my work. Checked the temperature logs, filled out the preparation paperwork, everything by the book. But I kept glancing back at Mr. Chen, kept feeling like I was being watched by someone who couldn't close their eyes. The third breath came when I finally stopped moving. When I stood still and let the silence settle. This time it wasn't beside my ear. It was in front of me, where Mr. Chen lay. A soft exhalation that seemed to carry frustration, urgency. The weight of something desperately needed to be said. I should have left. Should have finished my shift, gone home, forgotten about it. Instead, I pulled up a stool and sat beside the preparation table. Looked at Robert Chen's frozen expression and said quietly, "I'm listening." Nothing. Of course nothing. Dead men don't speak. But the heaviness in the room persisted. And in that stillness, I found myself talking anyway. I don't know what you wanted to say. I don't know if any of this is real, or if I'm losing my mind. But if you're trying to tell me something, I'm here. I'm paying attention. The silence that followed felt different, but full, like the pause after someone takes a breath to speak. I finished my work in that strange, waited quiet, locked up the preparation room, and went home as dawn was breaking. Told myself I'd imagined everything. Stress. Exhaustion. The brain playing tricks at ungodly hours. 3 days later, I worked Mr. Chen's funeral. His wife, Margaret, gave the eulogy. She was composed until the very end, when her voice cracked and the careful control shattered. The night before Robert died, we had an argument. The stupidest argument about nothing important. Who forgot to pay a bill, whose turn it was to call the insurance company. Married 32 years, and we wasted our last conversation on something that didn't matter at all. She paused, pressing a tissue to her eyes. He tried to say something to me. Right before the stroke hit, I saw his mouth open, saw him take a breath to speak. But then he collapsed, and whatever he wanted to say, she couldn't finish. just shook her head, the grief of not knowing written across her face. I stood at the back of the chapel, my hands gripping the back of a pew hard enough to hurt. The breath I'd heard, the weighted silence, the expression on his face that looked like interrupted speech. Robert Chen had died mid-sentence. Whatever he'd wanted to say to his wife, apology, reassurance, love, had been cut off by the stroke, trapped in a body that no longer responded, in vocal cords that would never vibrate again. But some part of him had still been trying, still attempting to push those words out, to complete that final thought. Even 8 hours after his heart stopped, some echo of that intention had remained. Or maybe I was insane. Maybe I'd invented meaning in random sounds because the human brain can't accept that some things end incomplete, that some words remain forever unspoken. After the service, Margaret found me near the guest book. "Thank you for taking care of him," she said, "for making him look peaceful. It helps, seeing him that way, like he wasn't suffering at the end." She searched my face with red-rimmed eyes. "When you were preparing him, was there anything unusual? Anything I should know?" I thought about the breath, the heaviness, the expression of unfinished business. I thought about Margaret's stares, her guilt over a meaningless argument, her grief over words never spoken. And I smiled gently and lied. "No, nothing unusual. He was very peaceful. Whatever he was feeling at the end, it wasn't pain. I'm certain of that." The relief on her face told me I'd made the right choice. Some truths don't bring comfort. They don't heal. They only give grief new shapes to take in the dark. What good would it have done to tell her that I thought it her husband's last breath, still searching for words? That even after 8 hours of death, his body seemed to carry the weight of a sentence that refused to end. It would have given her one more moment to replay. One more question with no answer. One more night staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had missed. So, I let the light stand. I let her believe he'd gone quickly, cleanly, without fear or awareness. I let the silence stay intact. I still work night shifts at Riverside Memorial. I still prepare the dead in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world outside feels distant and unreal. The building settles around me the way it always has, humming and clicking and breathing in its familiar, mechanical way. And sometimes, not often, but enough. I hear things that don't belong to the building, sounds that don't follow any pattern I recognize, presences that change the weight of the air without moving it. I don't talk about them. I don't document them. I've learned that some experiences exist in a space that refuses explanation, and trying to name them only makes them smaller than they deserve to be. What I know is this: death doesn't always arrive at the end of a thought. Sometimes it interrupts. Sometimes it cuts people off mid-word, mid-breath, leaving intentions stranded inside bodies that can no longer carry them forward. And sometimes, those unfinished intentions linger. Not as voices, not as apparitions, but as pressure, as rhythm, as the feeling that something is still waiting to be completed. I think about Robert Chen often, about the argument that shouldn't have mattered, about his wife's guilt, heavy and unresolved, about the breath I heard or imagined hearing carrying the weight of something that never found its way out. I hope he found peace. I hope whatever he tried to say wasn't essential, wasn't something that would have changed the course of a life. I hope it was something simple, ordinary. The kind of words people assume they'll always have time to say. But he'll never know. And Margaret will never know. And maybe that's the real horror. Not ghosts, not lingering presences, but the quiet certainty that some things are never finished. That death is indifferent to our timing. That it leaves sentences half-formed in meaning suspended with no place to land. The dead leave us with gaps, with silences, with questions that have no safe answers. The only choice we have is which of those silences to disturb and which to protect. I chose to protect Robert Chen S. And on nights when I'm alone in the preparation room, when the air grows heavy and something unseems to gather itself just out of reach, I make the same choice again. I listen. I acknowledge. And I let the words that almost were remain where they belong. Because some last breaths don't need to become last words. Sometimes, they only need to be heard, and then allowed to fade back into the silence they came from. 18 years in this profession, and I thought I'd seen every technical challenge the human body could present. Bodies that wouldn't drain properly. Tissue that wouldn't hold cosmetics. Limbs locked in positions that required creative casket arrangements. But I'd never encountered a body whose eyes simply refused to stay closed. Mr. James Brennan, 48 years old. Cardiac arrest at home, pronounced dead at the scene by paramedics. Clean medical history. No foul play, no suspicious circumstances. His wife had called 911 immediately. Tried CPR herself while waiting for help. Everything by the book. Except for his eyes. The first time I prepared him, I followed standard procedure. Moistened eye caps to create a natural contour. Positioned them carefully beneath the lids. Applied a thin layer of adhesive along the lash line. Gentle pressure to seal them. It's a routine I'd performed thousands of times. Muscle memory more than conscious thought. I turned to prepare the next stage of work, arterial injection. Cavity treatment, and when I looked back 3 minutes later, his eyes were open. Both of them. Staring at the far corner of the preparation room. I checked my work. The eye caps were still in place, the adhesive properly applied. There was no medical reason for this. I repeated the process, more carefully this time, ensuring every step was perfect. 3 minutes later, open again. Same fixed stare. Same corner. By the 7th attempt, I'd stopped following protocol and started following my instincts, which were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I tried different adhesives. Medical grade, stronger than we'd normally use. I tried additional cotton pattern. I tried positioning techniques I'd learned from colleagues with 40 years of experience. Nothing worked. And each time those eyes opened toward the same spot. Not wandering, not random. A specific corner of the room where nothing existed except white tile wall and the junction wire sealing that corner. I started avoiding that corner. Not consciously at first, just small adjustments to my position. Stepping around equipment in ways that kept me out of that direct line of sight. But by the afternoon, I realized I was moving in deliberate arcs around the preparation table, never crossing into the space where his gaze fell. My colleague Marcus noticed. "You doing a waltz over there? Daniel, why are you circling like that?" "Just working from different angles," I said, not meeting his eyes. I couldn't explain the feeling. But Mr. Brennan wasn't looking at the wall but through it. Through time. At something fixed in his memory that had burned itself into the muscles of his eyelids, forcing them open against death itself. The viewing was scheduled for the next evening. I had less than 24 hours to solve this, or I'd have to suggest a closed casket. Something families rarely wanted, especially for death that weren't traumatic. At 4 in the afternoon, I made the call I'd been dreading. "Mrs. Brennan," answered on the second ring, her voice hollow in the way that fresh grief makes everything hollow. I explained the situation as professionally as possible, using terms like muscle resistance and natural variation and technical considerations. "So you're saying," she paused, and I heard her breathing change. "You're saying James's eyes won't close." "I'm suggesting we might want to consider a closed cascade arrangement. We can create a beautiful presentation with photographs, flowers." "Which corner?" The question stopped me cold. "I'm sorry. Which corner of your preparation room is he looking at?" The hair on my arm stood up. "Mrs. Brennan, I don't think. Please. I need to know. Is it the far corner?" "To the right if you're standing at his feet." I looked at Mr. Brennan, at that unchanging stare. Yes. The sound she made wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a scream. It was something worse. Recognition and guilt compressed into a single exhalation. He came home early that day, she said. He never came home early. 23 years of marriage, he always called first. But that Thursday he just walked in. He must have forgotten something, or maybe. Her voice cracked. Maybe he knew, maybe some part of him knew. I should have stopped her. Should have told her she didn't need to tell me this. But I stood frozen, phone pressed to my ear, watching those open eyes. He walked into the bedroom. Stood right there in the doorway, the corner, the exact corner where the door opens. He saw me. He saw everything. Saw me with someone else. The preparation room felt colder, smaller. James didn't say anything. That was the worst part. He just stood there, looking at us, and then his hand went to his chest. He made this sound, not even a word. Just, her leaving him. And he collapsed. Right there in that corner. I called 911. I tried to help him, but his eyes were already open. Already fixed on that spot where he'd been standing. Where he'd seen. She was crying now, hard years of carefully maintained composure dissolving. The paramedics said it was instantaneous. Massive coronary. They said he probably didn't feel anything. That it was so fast his brain wouldn't have processed it. But Daniel, she used my first name, and somehow that made it worse. His eyes. They were already open when I reached him. Already looking at that doorway. Like he was still watching. Still seeing it happen. I looked at Mr. Brennan's face. The expression I thought was pain took on a different quality. Not physical agony, but something deeper. The moment when everything you believed about your life shatters. When the person you trusted most becomes a stranger. I can work with this, I said quietly. I'll make sure he looks peaceful for the viewing. Can you really make him look peaceful? Her voice was small. When he died like that, I thought about lies we tell for comfort. About professional mercies. About the gap between what happened and what families need to remember. I'll do my best, I said. After I hung up, I stood there for a long time. Just looking at James Brennan, 48 years old. Died of a broken heart in the most literal sense, the shocks, oh profound that his heart simply stopped. And his eyes had opened at that exact moment, the moment of betrayal. The moment that ended his life. I tried one more time to close them, knowing it wouldn't work. Knowing that whatever had locked his eyelids open wasn't muscle resistance or technical failure. It was the body holding on to that final image, that last thing he'd seen before the darkness. The brain dies in stages. The eyes are often the last to go, still feeding information to a consciousness that's shutting down. What had James Brennan's eyes captured in those final seconds? What image had they transmitted to a dying brain that then locked it into the body's memory? I ended up using a closed casket, told Mrs. Brennan it was for the best. That he would want to be remembered as he was in life, not in death. She agreed, relief and shame mixing in her voice. The funeral was well attended. People shared stories about James's kindness, his dedication to his work, his terrible jokes. His widow accepted condolences with dignity, and if anyone noticed the way she couldn't quite look at the casket, they attributed it to grief. I didn't tell anyone what I'd learned. Patient confidentiality extends beyond medical professionals. We in the funeral industry hold secrets too. The circumstances of death, the state of bodies, the private chains and hidden truths that only emerge when someone dies. But I think about James Brennan often. I think about how the heart can break, not metaphorically but literally. How shock can stop a heart as surely as any disease. How some pain is so acute, so immediate, that the body simply gives up. And I think about memory. How it can be burned into tissue. How the last thing we see can imprint itself so deeply that even death can't close the eyes against it. I've changed how I work since then. When I can't close someone's eyes, I don't just try harder. I consider what they might have seen. What moment might have been so powerful, so final, that the body refused to let go of it. Sometimes when families ask about the circumstances, I discourage those conversations. They went peacefully. I say, even when I don't know. Even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Because some truths don't need to be spoken. Some last moments should remain private. And some betrayals are recorded only in the body itself, in muscles that won't relax, in eyes that won't close. In the final gaze fixed on a corner of a room where trust died and took a heart with it. I still worked in that preparation room. I've performed hundreds of procedures since James Brennan, but I never stand in that corner anymore. Not because I believe in ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural, but because sometimes the body remembers what the soul couldn't bear to forget. And some images, once seen, can never be unseen, not by the living, and apparently, not even by the dead. The eyes hold everything. That's what they don't teach you in mortuary science school. They teach you the technical aspects. How to position the caps, how to apply the adhesive, how to create the appearance of peaceful rest. They don't teach you that sometimes the eyes refuse to rest, because sometimes they're still watching, still seeing, still locked on the moment when everything ended. 5 stories from those who work with the dead. Which one haunts you most? Comment below. Subscribe to Darkness Stories for weekly true horror. Like if you felt that, child. The darkness is always watching. See you next time.